Okay, so we're going to talk about connected accounts, and I got a lot to say about this particular topic, but let's just move forward a little bit. The first thing I want to talk about is the definition of what a pilot is versus a migration, because I think it's important we talk about it. A pilot is done as a test to see if something should be done. That's from a dictionary website, that's from Merriam-Webster. According to Wikipedia, a pilot is done to evaluate the feasibility. And I'm emphasizing this because the idea for a pilot, no matter how you define it to me, means that it is something that is not definite. All right? Maybe it's a little more definite than, say, an evaluation, but there's always the opportunity, or there's always a chance that a pilot could wind up not going forward with a full deployment or with a wider deployment because of some issue. So it's more in line with maybe a proof of concept where if we can prove that the concept is working correctly, then that's kind of the last hurdle. But by no means do I feel that a pilot should be considered the first step in a wide deployment. It is more so a test. And even Microsoft in their test plans, which we went over, has success criteria and test plans, right? So I feel that if we're still testing and if we're still trying to define what's a success and what's not, then there's the opportunity for failure. And that means that we need to have some sort of reversibility, some sort of rollback, either documented or automated or something. If we can't roll this back to where it was before the pilot, then it's not really a pilot. It's really the first step in deployment. And I think that that's important to make a note of. So when we talk about migration, and I kind of defined this earlier on, migration is the process of transferring data between computer systems. And Exchange talks about migration being the actual movement of mailboxes. So I think there's a pretty big distinction there. And I think that if we go to the exam objectives, we can see that there's sort of a progression. There's a chronological progression between the objectives. And you have, starting with Objective 1, provision Office 365. Then you plan the networking and security. Then you start to manage the cloud identities and the directory synchronization. Maybe you turn on federated services and federated identities at that point, and you learn how to monitor and troubleshoot Office 365. And then in the second test is where you get into actually starting to enable some of these services and roll out to users. But I think all the way back up in Objective 1 of the first exam, we can clearly see that we're talking about very, very preliminary things here. So I think that, in particular, the migration of mailboxes should not be included in Objective 1. And if we go down to the last objective of the second test, we see that recommend a mailbox strategy is part of Objective 4, plan for Exchange Online. So, in my opinion, the pilot process should not include migration of mailboxes, because that is sort of not irreversible, but it's difficult to come back from, and we'll talk about why. So it's really not the right move to make for a pilot program. Now, is there a better way? Is there a way to connect users to their existing email accounts in a way that allows them to keep the authoritative mail server in their legacy systems? Well, no, not really. But I kind of think that there could be. Microsoft chose not to let there be. If you're familiar with IMAP, and we'll get into IMAP a little bit, but when we use the desktop application for Outlook, we can set up IMAP accounts that all they do is access and synchronize to the IMAP servers. So that becomes something similar to what we should be using, even though we end up not using it. Okay, so they've got a couple of different ways that they want you to connect email in Office 365. The first one is called Simple Domain Sharing, and there's actually an article that's called Pilot Office 365 Users with a Few Email Addresses on Your Custom Domain. It talks about simple domain sharing. It seems very close to what we're trying to do. But if you look down, step 9 of it talks about moving mailbox contents. And again, this is a migration. I think it's way too early. I mean, we could talk about planning it, but in the pilot process, if we're forced to migrate mailboxes, and especially the way that we're forced to do it, it makes it very difficult to go back, very difficult to roll it back. So just be aware of that. We're going to go forward with it and show you how it works, but this is not this is a very intrusive process, part of the pilot. So just plan accordingly. So the way simple domain sharing works pretty much is that we've gone over some of the DNS records, but we're not going to move the DNS, the MX record to Office 365. The MX record is going to be maintaining to point to our on-premise solution or our third-party solution. And I'll use the terms on-premise and third-party sort of interchangeably. So all the mail from the internet that is destined for our domain is going to hit our on-premise or third-party environment. And again, I'm just going to use on-premise, but it could be a third-party hosting provider as well. And I'm using right now the email addresses and the third-party mail service ADatum. That all comes from that article. And I'm following along with Microsoft's article on how this works. But if we take some of those users and we create mailboxes for them in Office 365, and then on the third-party mail service, we set up forwarding so that any email that comes in is forwarded to Mike at cohowinery.onmicrosoft.com, then we wind up with the email coming into the ADatum mail server, being delivered to the local mailbox, and then a copy of that being forwarded to Mike at cohowinery.onmicrosoft.com. And this means that if he has a mobile device or Outlook or uses Outlook Online to connect to his Office 365, he'll see the incoming email, right? Because that email will have been forwarded from his on-premise solution. And that's fine. It doesn't look like a forward. It doesn't show that that top header that you normally see if you were to try to forward from Outlook because it's a server-based forward. So he'll see it as if it arrived in his mailbox addressed to Mike at cohowinery.com, even though it was technically forwarded to Mike at cohowinery.onmicrosoft.com. Okay. So what happens now if somebody, either Mike tries to send to somebody else in Office 365 or they try to send to him, some sort of inter-tenant email. So if you have multiple pilot users, maybe they're trying to send each other email. Well, even though the MX record is set up to use the third-party mail service or the on-premise mail service, Office 365 recognizes that that mailbox exists within the Office 365 tenant, so it doesn't need to route it anywhere. It delivers it locally. And that means a copy never makes it to the ADatum third-party mail service. So now we've got a situation where certain emails that are in Mike's inbox in Office 365 are not in his inbox in the on-premise mail service. So we've got some problems there because everything that goes to the third-party mail service should wind up in Office 365, but everything that's in Office 365 might not be in the third-party mail service. Okay, so what about sending email? What if he tries to send email to a coworker who is not part of the pilot program? Okay, so now he's sending email to a colleague. That email will have to be sent to the third-party mail service, and in order to do that, he's got to set the custom domain in Office 365 to be an internal relay. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means, but basically it's saying that Office 365 knows that that domain is not authoritative. It's not authoritative for that domain. Might be other services or mail servers out there that are hosting email. So just because it doesn't know about a user doesn't mean that the user doesn't exist. Then what it'll do is it'll say, hey, I don't have this user. Let me send it to an authoritative mail server. And it either uses a predefined send connector to do that, or it can look up an MX record and determine who the authoritative mail server is. And in this case, since we never moved the MX record and it's still with the legacy or existing email service, Office 365 will just send that email to the third party, which is fine, except for the fact that now that sent item is in the Office 365 mailbox and is not in the third-party mail service. So if you went into sent items on the existing email, you wouldn't see it there. And vice versa. If he connected to his third-party mail service and sent an email anywhere, that sent item would not sync back to the Office 365. So what are we saying with this? We're saying that if we want to keep any sort of consolidated and authoritative source for email at this point, we have to use the Office 365 mailbox because it's the only place that we know that email is going to be delivered regardless of whether it was sent internally in Office 365 or from the internet or from an on-premise user. Whatever it is, we know it's going to wind up in the inbox in Office 365. And we can't use both systems to send email because then we wind up with sent email in two different locations. So that means that we have to now start using our Office 365 for everything. And it's going to start accumulating emails both in the sent items and the inbox that will never wind up on the third party. So if we wanted to roll back and go back to our legacy system now, we'd have to figure out which of those emails they are, find those emails, and migrate them back to the old email server. So it's sort of more like a cutover than a pilot program or than a connected account. And once you do that cutover, you still have those historic emails in the third party or on-premise mail service. And how do you deal with those? Do you leave them there to age out, or do you at some point migrate them into the Office 365 environment? And anything that was landed in the third-party mail service and forwarded, once you migrate now, is going to become duplicates. So there's some issues there, but it's really more of a cutover than it is a pilot or a connected account. And this issue of sent items is very, very important, specifically if you're dealing with legal hold or any kind of e-discovery compliance, because now you have information that may not be caught when you do a search across your environment. Your email is kind of existing in two different places. I call it a fractured sent items, a fractured mailbox. You have basically two different mailboxes now that you have to pull information from and eliminate duplicates. And it just becomes very, very messy to have any kind of system where data can exist in two different places authoritatively, and you don't want that. So I don't like this idea at all. All right, let's move on. So we also have the option of using POP and IMAP. And POP is an older protocol. It was very popular when people were using email from their internet providers. Sometimes you'd sign up for an internet account and they would give you an email address. And, a long time ago, that was sort of your only option. If you signed up for AOL or you signed up for cable or anything like that, sometimes they'd give you an email address and you would have some sort of client, maybe Outlook Express, or before the age of webmail, you would have to be able to check your email and it would go to the server and it would make a connection and download all that email and probably delete it off the server at that point. And that was kind of what POP was. It copied or really it moved it from the server to your client, and your client, that's where all the email was. So it was no longer on the server, and if you broke your computer and didn't have a backup, all that email was gone. Well, it really wasn't a good enough solution for a lot of people, especially if you wanted to check your email from multiple devices. How would you go about doing that? So the idea was we needed another system that didn't download the email from the server. It kept it on the server as the authoritative source, and that way everyone's mailbox could be backed up, and particularly for corporate environments, it's very important. We no longer downloaded it to our clients, we synchronized it, which means it's a download, but it's more of a copy than a move. IMAP allowed us not only to synchronize new emails, but to synchronize any kind of folder manipulations we did, create new folders, move messages around, delete messages. We were able to use our client how we saw fit and then still have that synchronized back to the server so that any other client that connected to the server would see those changes and our changes would propagate across all devices. So that was really the benefits of using IMAP. And to this day, IMAP is a very, very good solution for any sort of email that requires synchronization across multiple devices. Of course, nowadays, a lot of corporate environments have Exchange. Exchange supports, it used to support MAPI, and then it was RPC over HTTPS. Now it's called Outlook Anywhere, and it becomes very, very rich because Microsoft owns not only the server, but also the clients. So it kind of talks its own language. But for anything, if you use any part that isn't Microsoft, if you use a non-Microsoft server, or if you use a non-Microsoft client, or you don't want to use the ports that Exchange and Outlook require, although now I think it should run over 443 most of the time, SSL connections, you have to use IMAP. It's really the next best thing after using, again, Outlook Anywhere, which used to be RPC over HTTPS, and which used to be MAPI. So the idea here is, if we're going to try to connect our email and download or migrate email from an existing client into our mailbox in Exchange, or in Exchange Online, Office 365, we should be able to use the IMAP protocol to do this. And that is what a connected account is. The idea with a connected account is, the idea with a connected account should be like it is with Outlook Desktop, where if you add a IMAP account, it keeps it separate. It keeps the inbox separate. It keeps all the folders separate. When you send mail, it gets sent from that IMAP account, so it's completely separate from the rest of your regular email that's in Outlook. However, when you're using the Outlook desktop application, it's not called a connected account. Connected account specifically refers to connecting it in Office 365. And unlike with the Outlook desktop app, it's much different when you do a connected account in Exchange. So it will bring in those initial emails and folders. However, it merges them in. It doesn't keep them separate. So anything that was in the inbox on the source account is going to become part of the inbox on the Office 365 account. It will maintain the folders. It'll bring in over all the folders that were in there, and any emails that were in those folders will be synchronized to the folders. So if you have all of your emails organized, they won't be merged into the inbox on Office 365, so that's a plus. Any new emails that come in, if the connected account is still active, it will synchronize new emails. If you create new folders, it'll synchronize new folders. And even if you send items from the old legacy email, it'll synchronize those as well. But it won't synchronize deletes in either direction. And it won't synchronize moving emails between folders in either direction. So if you try to move emails around within folders on either of those systems, those changes won't propagate to the other. It also won't push or sync anything from the Office 365 account down to the IMAP server, the existing mail server. So you really can't say that these two are being synchronized the way that normally IMAP would work. And I don't know if this was by design or Microsoft just assumes you don't have a need for it. But the whole idea behind IMAP is that you can manage your email from a client and have those changes sync back to the server. When you're unable to make changes on either side and have them sync across, you can no longer maintain synchronization. And if that's the case, then what are we really using this for, right? So what is the point of using a connected account? Well, the only way we can use a connected account that makes any sense is for that initial download of email when we do a migration. So we connect our IMAP account from our existing mail server to Office 365. It downloads all the folders, it downloads all the email, but from that point on, we're also migrating it as an active mailbox. So we start using the Exchange Online or the Office 365 mailbox going forward. It's the only way it makes sense. So again, Microsoft, I feel like, goes out of its way to say, if you're going to use connected accounts, if you're going to use Office 365 mailboxes in general, they become the active mailbox. They become the authoritative mailbox going forward. Again, it's a cutover. Okay, well, let's take a demo. Let's set up domain name sharing, and let's set up connected accounts using IMAP to our on-premise environment that we have in our lab, and we'll see how they both work.